being implemented by the department. Our final presentation for the session is titled Reducing Industry Transaction Costs Due to Seismic Activity, presented by Knuckey, Director of Fishwell Consulting, and I think Chris Calogeras as well, Director of CA Consultants. The working relationship between the fishing industry and the oil and gas sector and the extensive use of seismic survey equipment is relatively new, and there is a lack of understanding by both sectors on the impact that is having on each other. Ian and Chris will discuss how a coordinated approach to addressing this matter will lead to greater efficiencies, reduce costs, and allow both sectors to more efficiently plan their operations to improve profitability and reduce conflict situations. I will now hand over to Ian and Chris. Thanks.
Thank you, Dylan. It is actually just Ian presenting. Chris is just going to heckle from the back, as is usual. Yeah, sure. And I'll also start by saying that, unlike the other two presentations, I'm not starting off with a disclaimer. But I do have professional indemnity insurance, so I hope that squares everything off. I'm not sure. But it's a project that we've been working on for quite some time, and it's reducing the fishing and petroleum industry transaction costs associated with seismic. And I haven't got many pictures, unlike the other presentations, but I've got one that I think says quite a bit. This is a picture showing the effort distribution of Australia's biggest scalefish fishery, the southeast fishery, around Bass Strait. The little pixelated areas, the trawl fishery, and the larger pixels are the Danish seine fishery. And I'll just overlay on that the extent of seismic operations over the last decade or so in that same area. And that picture says it all, really. And the two sectors I'm talking about, the petroleum and the fishing industry sector, overlay in a range of areas across Australia. This is an example in Bass Strait, but it's the same in many areas around Australia. So there is obvious interactions that occur. This project was looked at how do we minimise the extent of those interactions in terms of the impact. The project came about through work that Chris and I were doing with Empowering Industry over a number of years, where we used to go out to industry and talk about what are the big issues that are burning, what's their interest, what's the things they'd like to see, a bit of research and development going into. And the interaction between the petroleum industry and the fishing industry was high up there across Australia. It was one of the big issues that people were talking about. And there were two main areas. One is the actual sonification and its impact on fish resources, and that work has been, there's been various projects of that, as John's explained, but there's also work, particularly in Bass Strait, where they've looked at the impacts of that on particularly the scallop fishery, rock lobster, and some other species there. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the second point, which was the business impacts for both industries. And throughout this talk I'll emphasise that it is actually talking about both operations. I'm not just talking about impacts on the fishing industry. I'm not just talking about the petroleum industry. There's a lot of joint issues that they both share. And we got funding from FRDC to underpin this work, which largely involved a lot of going out and speaking to the different sector groups, both the fishing industry and the petroleum industry, to talk to their members, talk to their people about what were the big issues. And we focused our case study areas on three areas around Australia. There's many more that we could have done, but three areas around Australia where a lot of work has been done and is currently operating, and that was in Bass Strait, one of the historically intensively fished areas, and also in one of the first areas for large-scale petroleum interest, Northern Territory and the northwest of Western Australia. And we looked at the background legislation and regulations that underpin the two industries, and we sort of mapped both of the sectors in terms of understanding the impacts that they experienced and what was driving them and what were their concerns. What we came up with was a range of specific issues that were often common to both sectors, and there was about 6 major issues. There's a number of smaller ones, but which I'll go through. The first one was easy access to information, and it affects both sectors. We found that from the seismic or the petroleum sector's point of view, they would come to a region, they would have to try and get information about multiple fisheries types from multiple jurisdictions, information on the main season's fishing, the depths fished, where the extent of the fishing occurred. Very difficult to find all that information. All of us who work in the fishing industry think, you know, it's easy found, you can point to this document for this and that for that. But if you're trying to get an overarching view of what's happening in, say, the Bass Basin or the Otway Basin or something like that, to come in cold and try and find that information is very difficult, especially the information they need to know. Then they're less interested in the stock assessments, it's how the fishery operates, how they can best interact with fishermen. Put the shoe on the other foot, and you've got the fishing industry who generally work in a localised area, although they're far more mobile now. What they see is what they get maybe by letter or email about a particular company coming to see them about the potential seismic operations. But they only get it from one or two. The issue is they might get it from 10 different, there's so much going on that they tend to drown in understanding the big picture. Okay, I might be able to understand, you know, this particular company's involvement, but now I've got another 8 like them operating in the same area. I've got no idea of the big picture goals and objectives of the petroleum industry in my area. And so that was a big issue there. So very hard to get this information. Again, you know, your fishing industry can go to one company and find out a bit there, but he's trying to do that for multiple companies, which brings me to the second major issue is the liaison and consultation involved in dealing with multiple stakeholders. And it's really problematic for both sectors. It trips them up. You hear the good examples, you know, and John mentioned one, you know, with the company and Rock Lobster, where you've got one company, one major industry, and they can work through and, you know, have a dedicated liaison officer, and, you know, all sweet. And you do get, there are some excellent examples where that has come. The wheels start to fall off when you're dealing with multiple companies. Like we've got Simon here from Sedfield working in, you know, with his industry members in the Bass Strait area, dealing with 8 and 9 different companies at different stages of running seismic surveys or exploratory and drilling issues, trying to keep his head above what's going on across multiple stakeholders. And as mentioned as well, for the petroleum sector, they're coming in, not only are they dealing with fisheries from different jurisdictions, so they're going to understand the state and Commonwealth differences and, you know, and their peculiarities, but fishermen with different gears, different sectors, fishermen where one sector has multiple associations, where they work from. You can often look at an area, think you've got it, but you realise you've got people from Eden fishing around, you know, the other side of Victoria. Very difficult again for the petroleum industries to deal with the multiple stakeholder groups, and they tend to be looked for help that way. So that is one of the other big issues there. There is a real lack of understanding, and this is the third issue, of the drivers and issues behind the other sectors. We know our sector well, we know the drivers, we know what matters, what doesn't matter. Very difficult to come into another sector and try and understand what the drivers are. And again, for the petroleum industry coming in, well, you know, what's their influence of markets, of peak seasons, of, you know, when is the main catch, is there closed areas, is there closed seasons? All that information, understanding the drivers behind the fishing industry. They might think that because you're under quota, we're not taking a quota away, you can move, you just move and catch elsewhere. Without understanding the transaction costs of steaming further, of fishing, you know, on someone's ground that you don't previously like or work with, or moving your operations to another area. So it's a difficulty in understanding those complexities that we in the fishing industry understand well and see how our dynamics work, but someone coming outside doesn't understand. Similarly with the fishing sector, trying to understand the drivers behind the processes involved in the seismic testing. Now, John gave a brief description of what is involved there, but it's quite a huge amount of regulatory constraints and what they have to do with their environmental plans, notifications that they have to do that, again, the industry, the fishing industry doesn't understand as well as they should. So one of the big recommendations we're making is that the potential for this exchange of information, it's the relationship building that needs to happen to improve on this situation. A couple of the other issues, and again, there's some really great examples of where people have done it well. Often it's when it's a one-on-one situation where oil and gas have worked well with fishing industry, they've worked it out. As John says, a lot of it's commercial in confidence, the deals they come up with, so we can't really get an insight into that. But there is good, and you speak to industry on both sides and they say, not a problem, we sorted it out, not a problem. But there's other nightmare cases here about where people are only paying lip service really to the consultation process and the liaison process, and that really undermines, and it was said before by Michelle, the trust can be destroyed by one bad company, which destroys perceptions of a whole industry, and that's happened in many times. Then we get down to some of the more specific operational issues where you're dealing with fishing vessels operating with seismic vessels and boats and fishing gears, and again, a lot of sort of one-off solutions have been found, but there is a need for some consistency of approach potentially with that and how it's done. And another one which was a bit offside, which we didn't really predict, was this access and increasing costs of shared facilities, shared port facilities, where the two industries come together at one point at the port to share facilities, and the size of the petroleum industry and their expectations of these large companies on OHS requirements, safety requirements and all that are at a different level. What might have been potentially involved in some baggy-ass fisherman sort of fishing out of his dinghy in there, and getting those two different scales of something working together is quite a different approach. And even just sharing the facilities of fishing boats and oil and gas and petroleum vessels in a port where often the port is limited by infrastructure creates some real issues that people are still working out how to deal with, especially again when you're dealing with in the fisherman's case a product which has a time limit on it, and so you need to get to market to get the best value for your product. What we've found here, or what we're recommending, is that there are 4 processes for improvement. 1, accessible central information available for both sectors. The opportunity for regional stakeholder meetings where people get together and actually talk about what's happening now and what is over the horizon for both industries. We think the one-on-one, whether it's a company or individuals or sectors, the one-on-one remains a very critical part of this relationship, and efforts should be done to improve and make sure that remains. And also, it's unfortunate that Renee is presenting at the other forum at the moment on the Roundtable Network, which I think is, and the MOU that's been struck between the petroleum industry, the oil and gas industry and the fishing industry, which paints a pathway forward to how they may work together, and that is an obviously very constructive first step for further collaboration. So just to provide a bit on each one of these, potentially it's an obvious case where some web-based access to information is needed. For the fishermen getting paper-based information, it's difficult. They come around, they've got a short turnaround where they've got to do a lot. They need to access information at their own time and speed and when they would like to. And there's actually a lot of information around that is valuable for this. It just has no front end. There's no real good way of accessing that information. But I'll point to some things, and certainly the work that NOPSEMA has done with its the environmental plan submission tool. They're providing a lot of that where you can go and say, I work in this area, what submission is in place and where's that, but really no one knows about it outside the oil and gas, and it would be valuable to get for the industry sector. And some of these other GIS-based spatial information where you can collect information on what's going in your area can paint the picture of what's important, who's operating in your area, and will be valuable. The communication, there's various ways that can be done, but the need for some electronic communication, whether it's by SMS or some means of relatively short-term information between the oil and gas and the fishing industry sector, will be an important part. And also, I think, in a way, it's easier for the fishing industry to get information on the oil and gas sector, even though it's difficult to obtain, than it is the other way around. And I think the petroleum industry needs some, key information on the different fishing groups and associations and those involved, and how to get that. And we're sort of suggesting that some of these simple tools that really paint, this is just really a mind map of the fishing industry, in the commercial fishing industry in Victoria, where you can see who's involved where, what associations involved, how many licences are there, how many are fishermen, where do they operate. So if you're coming in into this area, you can say, okay, well, I've contacted this, how well have I represented my legislative requirements to consult and work with the fishing industry. Yet this information is very difficult to find anywhere. We've developed some of these for the case studies where in this project, but to have that information at hand for oil and gas companies to come and collect information would be useful. But it's really only part of the information gathering. Here's a mock-up we might have done, again, working in the Bass Strait region, a mock-up of the information that you might be able to get online relatively easily to paint a picture of the industries you're working with. And this might be the jurisdiction under which the fisheries are operating, the gears they're using, to give an idea of where the major areas are in the fishery that they operate. And one of the things that's very important for the oil and gas industry is understanding how to minimise the impact on the fishing sector, which needs knowing when is their major fishing times, what are their major products, and also an understanding of the long-term catching effort that's involved in the fishery. So it's just getting this information out. And again, there are various spots you can get this, but having it accessible in an easy format that people can get to is very important. Okay. The idea of regional meetings, I think, has quite a bit of support, whether they're annual or biennial, the need for them, but looking at the immediate to medium-term future, where I think people get together at a basin level, at the regional level. So, for instance, in the northwest slope or the northwest basin, getting together where members of the fishing industry from all sectors can talk to the various operators in there. Wondering whether that can be a part of the start of the planning process, the start of the relationship building process, where people can sit down and understand what is over the horizon. I've spoken to people and said, what is the value for that? It's just time. But the combined time and resources required when you're meeting with individual companies one-on-one starts to get, for fisheries associations, they just can't afford that level of time. I don't know if you saw Simon's presentation earlier, but he's starting to charge for that because it's a big impost on his time when you're dealing with each individual company separately. So what efficiencies may be gained by these groups coming together once a year or every 2 years to look at what's happening now and what's happening over the future. How much time and energy will that save? But more importantly, how much does that start the network and networking and relationship building of, over the next couple of years? The one-on-one industry discussions, I can't emphasise how important that maintains, and whether you do it with, as John mentioned, some industry liaison officers, how you go about that. There is still a critical need to maintain some level of one-on-one discussions between the proponents of seismic and fishing industry. You can't get better that face-to-face work at some level throughout the process. And as Renee's probably wrapping up at the moment, the roundtable discussion and feedback has been a great first step, and we should build and utilise the current process, making sure we have the key industry players involved. And it's a forum that we can use to talk about issues that are important to both sectors. and facilitate improved communication, cooperation, and they're those same three C words coming out again in all three talks, and seek agreed way forwards, and also to enhance the linkages with NOPSEMA, APIA and the other associations involved in this. So that's where I'll leave it. Where we're going here is this project is going to wrap up. We're presenting basically this information to the roundtable, who is effectively working as our steering group. We will try and see if there's facilities to bring this collation of information together. We'll finalise our report and then share the findings with both industry sectors. But I wonder whether, as a first step, one of these regional planning meetings, could get underway in one of these basins to start things off. Thank you.